Hi, this is my review of Beasts and Barbarians, Golden Edition. Beasts and Barbarians is a sword and sorcery setting for the Savage Worlds role-playing game system. This is basically allows you to create stories such as those expected in the legends of heroic barbarians such as Conan. Now, let's talk about the quality of this physical book. The quality is great. It's one of the best softcover books that I have ever seen. It's just everything is just very durable, very sturdy, and you have some pretty amazing illustrations. I will show you the illustrations as I get into the contents. Look, you have an entire map of the area of the continent where you are adventuring, and some very appropriate illustrations for the theme, for the subject matter. And everything is generally well written. However, there are some typos and strangely constructed sentences, which makes me think, I'm probably right, that that English isn't this author's main language. But there's really nothing that prevents you from understanding how to play the game, so that's good. And you have an index, and everything is the quality is good. Now let's talk about the content. Well, first of all, the book presents you a lot of background information concerning the lore and the history of the setting, on the different transformations the continent went through, and how this empire stood strong, and then this thing called the Dread Star, which is kind of like a meteorite that fell from the sky and made a huge crater and destroyed that empire. And then all sorts of weird creatures starting to appear, some perhaps as a consequence of the mysterious power of this Dread Star. And then you see the development of iron, the development or discovery of this way to make iron weapons. And you can see a clash, and at the same time a cohabitation of civilization with barbarism. And so you have a lot of cultures that feel barbaric, and some others that feel civilized. And you see the rise and fall of the empires, of the different struggles between tribes, etc. You have all the tools needed to create a story that feels a lot like Conan the Barbarian or the Barbarian Brothers, that sort of thing. Now, in general, the setting is good. However, I think that they dropped the ball a bit when it comes to the different cultures. So, for example, we have different types of people. You can see them here. You can recognize some of them as Celtic or Nordic, and Roman and African, etc. You have some Oriental races as well. However, I think sometimes they try too hard to create a combination or mixture of different cultures, and resulted with something somewhat nonsensical. So, for example, you have the Balk, and the Balk feel a bit like Mongol tribes. However, they are ruled by women. They're sort of like a matriarchy, and these ruling women are called Valkyries. And they never explain in a clear way if the Valkyries are natural blondes or if they dye their hair. But they rule over the Balks, which I was telling you, they feel like Mongols, but they are also sort of like demon summoning priestesses. So that's kind of weird. I don't know why they try to add Valkyries to Mongols, and at the same time these Valkyries act like sort of like the priestesses or sorcerers that try to make pacts with demons, etc. So it's a bit nonsensical. It kind of feels like, maybe, let's say I want to do some sort of culture that feels British, and then I added that this culture is ruled by this man called the Tenshi, which is the Japanese version of Angel, and this Tenshi can control leprechauns. So that's a bit too weird and nonsensical in my opinion, and harms what I consider to be an otherwise pretty good setting, and background information. So that's basically my only criticism when it comes to the background. And not all of the races are that appropriate to play as a player character. You can create a character belonging to any of these different cultural groups. However, it's going to be a bit difficult to have, for example, a bulk, which because they are ruled by these demon priestesses, you will have to find an excuse on why the bulk is adventuring away from their command or their orders. And perhaps the pygmy and the Cairn Lord are also somewhat difficult to integrate into a party, because the Cairn Lords feel a bit like Celtic tribes that worship and sometimes even have intercourse with the dead. In fact, your Cairn Lord character could become sort of like half undead, half human, because he was born to a human mother and a spirit of the dead, and you're kind of like half undead with different traits related to that. And the pygmy are also somewhat savages at times. That is, that they could not get along with a lot of the other party members. But it's any game master can find a way or a reason to build a party with these races. This illustration looks quite cool. Almost all of the illustrations, as you can see, they sometimes have a very realistic feel to them, and at other times they look kind of like a comic book. We have some other illustrations here, and they all represent different staples and characteristic elements of sword and sorcery. And the setting overall, when it comes to background information, it feels quite savage, quite brutal, with a lot of civilization on the brink of destruction, a lot of tribes that make all sorts of pacts and worship demons and the dead, and so it's a very savage and lethal world. When you create a character, you have several heroic concepts that you have seen in many different fantasy stories. So for example, you create an Amazon, an adventurer, an assassin, mercenary, a nomad, and there are three of those concepts that I find quite iconic of the sword and sorcery genre. For example, we have the barbarian. Of course, everybody knows the heroic archetype for barbarian. You also have the monk, which are basically like martial artists with extraordinary powers. And you also have the Lotus Master, and this is a very cool class. As many of you know, in the Conan or the Barbarian stories, Lotus plays a somewhat subtle but significant part. And you also have the Sorcerer, and the Sorcerer has more to do with summoning demons in a very eldritch or Lovecraftian way. I'll get a bit more into that in a few minutes. You also have more information about how to integrate skills of the Savage Worlds system into this setting. And you have hindrances, and when it comes to hindrances and the edges presented in this book, they add a lot of color and flavor, and they really set the tone for the entire game. So for example, as hindrance, you could be a damsel in distress. If you have a female character, you know how they always get in those stories, they get kidnapped and captured. So you're somewhat weak at fighting, but at the same time you inspire others to save you because they are in love with your character. But you don't necessarily have to play as a female character to do this. You could have a male, maybe sort of like a pretty boy, adventuring with Amazons, and they're all nuts about him, but he's quite weak at fighting, and they get inspired to protect him. They receive bennies and bonuses to protect him. And then you have fear of magic. As you remember, Conan never liked magic. He had this taboo or superstition related to all things occult, even though he was quite knowledgeable with some very arcane languages, and he was also quite skilled at finding out the weak points of different demons and monsters. But there are also some edges that embrace the ridiculousness of some of the wilder elements of sword and sorcery. So, for example, if you want to play a barbarian who's always running around half naked, you can do this with the loincloth hero or bikini hero in Edge. They basically allow you to be wearing nothing but a skimpy outfit, and but your skin's quite tough. So if they actually manage to wound you, your soak roll is going to be very effective, and you could also scale this to loincloth god or bikini goddess to be even more resistant to damage. So you will be able to jump into a melee against 10, 15 opponents, and you will come out of it relatively on scratch or unscathed. So that's pretty cool. You have a lot of edges that represent those characteristic elements or staples of the sword and sorcery genre, but I think they could have added a bit more. I felt like oh, those are all the edges, so like I wanted a bit more. Maybe they are setting it for more supplements, but it would have been nice if they included more of that here. And when it comes to power edges, you basically have all the necessary information to make your Lotus Master to feel like a Lotus Master. So a Lotus Master is basically like a poisoner, sort of in a way of speaking, although he has some other traits. But you're creating these pouches or bags of lotus powder and tossing them around, and they explode and may poison the enemy and some other effects. So it's playing with those, let's say, chemical concoctions. And when it comes to sorcery, well, you basically cast spells, but with a high risk of a backlash that may even kill your character in an unfortunate situation, because you're calling these demonic beings. They somewhat feel quite Lovecraftian, and it makes sense because, as many of you know, Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard were buddies, so their stories kind of mixed very well together. And when it comes to the monk, which is the path of enlightenment, you have all those almost like Shaolin abilities or Jedi, almost Jedi-like abilities, so you can be an incredibly effective fighter and performing all sort of things like stomping the ground and shaking things up in an unnatural way, kind of like slightly like a superhero, not as exaggerated, but you kind of feel like that. And that's basically it when it comes to the way you can build your character. Oh, this merchant looks really greedy. I really like this picture. It's kind of like he's going to overcharge you for that blade. And you have a list of equipment. There are just a few additions to the weapons that you see in the Savage Worlds core book or the Fantasy Companion. They are still quite significant in the way they color the setting. And you also have some setting rules that have to do with some things that you expect to see in a sword and sorcery adventure. For example, there are rules that will determine that maybe your hero always starts the adventure quite poor, because, as you know, in those stories they're always spending this well-earned fortune in a night of drinking and women and very short-term pleasures, and so your character is always going to start the adventure poor. And it talks more about how to handle henchmen and right hands for the villains, and etc. Just those characteristic elements. You have more information on how to run beasts and barbarians. So it's basically a pulpy setting that it still feels quite gritty yet heroic, and magic is a thing to be feared, very mysterious and creepy at times. And there's also going to be exploration and combat, of course, but they tell you how to balance things out. And you get some pretty interesting rules so that you can play a story similar to Conan the Barbarian, where you have a lone barbarian hero but very powerful. He doesn't need to be a barbarian, but any hero that you create or adventurer, you can use these rules to make him really powerful, so that you can face off against an entire group of enemies with a lot of chances of survival, and that's very cool for someone who maybe you have a short, very small group or just one player. You can play with this rule set, and you also have the heroic duo, and this is for those of you who like the Barbarian Brothers film. You can play with two people who are quite powerful and can tackle an entire adventure by themselves. There are a lot of ways to tweak the settings. So, for example, you have a way to make it a humorous game, because there are some things that feel quite silly in some of the sword and sorcery stories. So, for example, here you have an edge that gives you a special ability to produce a destructive barbarian belch that paralyzes your foe, and if you maybe you drank some beer or alcohol or whatever, you're going to emit a more powerful version of that barbarian belch. You also have a rule to run in high heels. As you can see, those heroines sometimes ridiculously move around the ruins and destroyed landscapes in their high heels, and they never trip. So we have rules to deal with that. They can even do like a special kick attack with their heels, but if you fumble, you will trip. So that's very funny. We also have a lot of powerful relics and magical items, like the Helm of Coramos and Imp's Mandible, Cup of Sacrifice, etc. All those things that the barbarian could find. Oh, this is a very cool illustration of a barbarian right here. And after that, you also have rules on how to generate random adventures. As you know, a lot of the Savage World settings use a deck of cards to create an adventure and know everything that's related to it, enemies, the plot line, the goal of the adventure, etc. And you have a decent bestiary. I would have liked it if they had added more monsters or more supernatural creatures, but it's just decent. You have enough creatures to present the adequate challenges to your players. But the cool thing is, besides that, you also have a gallery of NPCs that could serve as patrons, as enemies, or as allies. So that could be considered somewhat of a part of the bestiary. And that's very useful. Or in an emergency, maybe they could serve as sort of like pre-generated characters. At the end, you also have an adventure. Now, I'm not going to spoil this adventure because I know some players and not only game masters are watching this review because they're interested in the rules. And the adventure basically presents a lot of opportunities to succeed at combat, at your diplomacy, or using people's skills, at exploration. So you don't have to feel like it's too heavy-handed to a certain theme or flavor. A variety of different skills are going to be needed to tackle this adventure, and that's really cool when it comes to playing a game with just one or two player characters. Because of the special rules, you will be able to create a competent character with the skills and abilities to tackle any adventure. So overall, what do I think of Beasts and Barbarians? Well, this is a pretty good setting for Savage Worlds, and the book is pretty handy. It's just really small and really easy to have at the table. But I was slightly disappointed because of what I'm telling you, that of the bulks, that they had these Valkyries that summon demons that makes no sense at all. And I would have liked that if they cut some of the fluff, even though the background information is pretty good. Sometimes they tend to repeat a bit of it, and I thought, well, didn't I just read that a few pages ago? So maybe if they cut a bit of that and added more monsters and edges, it would have been a lot nicer. And this game is still very much supported by the company, by Gramel. So they have a bestiary, more information of a city, the Jalisar, and other regions or areas of the map. So if you don't have time to homebrew your own version of that area or those places, this is a very well supported game. Or, well, decently supported. It's not like they're bringing out a supplement each month, which is sometimes ridiculous at times, in my opinion, because they don't put enough effort. They usually release things with a lot of errata, but in this case, thankfully, it is not so. They release the product like between 4 or 3 months, and you're going to be sure that despite some typos, it's going to be a top quality product. Well, thanks for watching my review. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. See you later.